Hello, ladies and germs. Welcome to the business end of the lecture series. Here we're going to be looking at macroeconomics. So we'll be leaving behind the arid fields of microeconomics, the supply and demand curves, perfect competition, monopolistic markets, and blah blah blah, and moving on to looking at the economy as a whole. So just to remind ourselves about what macroeconomics is, it's the science of describing, explaining and predicting the behaviour of the economic system as a whole. Now when we talk about the economic system, what do we mean? Do we mean a national economy? Do we mean a regional economy? What? A global economy? Well, anything greater than a single market for a particular good is technically moving towards at least macroeconomics. We are looking at interrelated markets, connected together, functioning as a system of markets that are regulated by governments in various ways. Normally, when we're talking about an economic system, we're talking about the national economic system. That is, we're talking about the economy of a nation state, such as Australia or the Netherlands or Zimbabwe, according to the lines drawn on the map by colonial monsters over a century ago or more. So, what are the kind of variables that we'll be looking at? Well, since we're not looking at a particular good or a particular market, but rather groups of markets, then we have to be working in terms of aggregates. So the kinds of aggregates, for example, we'd be looking at would be, say for example, the general price level. We wouldn't be looking at the price of eggs, or the price of bananas, or the price of bricks. We're looking at the general level of prices in the economy as a whole. Total output, that is, the total amount of goods and services produced in the economy as a whole over some period of time. We're not looking at the number of bricks produced, the number of apples produced. We're interested in the total number of goods and services produced, rather than thinking about, say for example, the number of bricklayers who are unemployed or the number of blast furnace operators who are unemployed. We're interested in the total number of people who are unemployed in the economy as a whole. Technically, we're even interested in the total number of resources, not just labour, but the total number of resources unemployed. Normally we're interested most in labour, however. Or total consumption expenditure, rather than being interested in the total amount spent on bananas or the total amount spent on books or the total amount spent on desks. We're interested in the total amount of consumption expenditure in the economy as a whole. So you're getting the idea of the kinds of variables that macroeconomists are interested in. They're aggregate variables, not the variables related to individual behaviour. So how do we think about an economy as a whole? It's obviously a giant and complex system, and it might be quite daunting to be expected to give an account of how a whole economy will operate. Well, luckily for us, down through the centuries has been distilled a nice, simple way of thinking about the economy as a whole. It's not the only way, but it is a simple and useful way to start thinking about it. In fact, this kind of model goes way, way, way back to the very beginning of economics. Its genesis in the mid to late 1700s with a group of economists, we now call them economists, called physiocrats, who were based in France. You can look them up on the internet. Extremely interesting group of people, and I mean that in the loosest sense of the term. Anyway, we can think about an economy as a whole in terms of the flow of money through the economy in exchange for goods and services. And that money can be thought of as income for the production and sale of those goods and services. So let's start off really simple. The most basic element to our economy is households and businesses. So we've got, or let's think of it this way, consumers and producers. That, you could say, would be the core of our economy. Now, the businesses are going to be supplying income to the households. Why? Because the households will be supplying to the businesses the resources necessary for the production of goods and services. So money will flow from businesses to households. However, money will also flow from households to businesses, because the households will purchase goods and services produced by the businesses. We're assuming households can't produce their own goods and services. The businesses produce the goods and services, so there's consumption expenditure. So let's call that C, and we'll call the overall income going from businesses to households Y. Alright, so this is the core of our economy. Resources owned by the households are sold to businesses for income, Y. Businesses transform those resources into goods and services which are purchased by the households as consumption. So this is consumption expenditure, C. That's the core of our economy. Now we might want to say, well, that's a reasonable start, but surely it's more complicated than that. Isn't there? There's banks, for example. Where are they? And where's the government, for example? And presumably there are other economies out there in the world which our core economy could interact with. So let's put them in. So households, on receipt of the income from selling their resources, or hiring out their resources, they don't just spend it on consumer goods, they save some of it, presumably. So we need a banking or a financial system. Some of the income will be spent, C, and some of the income will be saved, put into the banking system. The banks, however, don't just hoard that money, rather they lend it out. Who do they lend it to? Well, let's say in our simple system, predominantly they lend it to the businesses for investment purposes. What do we mean by investment purposes here? We mean expenditure on goods and services which are explicitly produced for the purpose of producing additional goods and services. Basically things like machines, factories, so on. Things that produce other things. Spending on that is called investment. So we've got savings, leaks out of the core of the economy, but if everything goes according to plan, is injected back into the economy again, the core of the economy, in the form of investment expenditure. So we could write down our lists of leakages or withdrawals and injections from and to the core, savings and investment. But surely these are not the only things that can happen to income. Some of the household's income will be taken in tax by the government. And the government will inject that money back into the core in the form of expenditure on various kinds of goods and services that are produced by businesses. So we have a leakage out, taxation, and an injection back in, government expenditure. And then, lucky last, the households wouldn't just be spending their money on goods and services produced by local businesses. They could also spend some of their money on goods and services produced by overseas businesses. So we have the overseas sector, and households spend some of their income on imported goods. Now that's a leakage from the system as a whole, because that's money that's leaving the core of the economy and is going to some other businesses outside. But you could also say that there'll be injections back into the system in the form of export revenue, because foreigners would buy Australian produced goods and services. So we have a withdrawal, import expenditure, but also an injection back into the system, export expenditure by foreigners. And that, you could say, pretty much rounds out the main elements or sectors of our economy. We have a household sector which consumes, a business sector which produces. We've got a banking system which acts as an intermediary between households and businesses. Money that is left over by households can be injected back into the system and used by businesses in the form of investment. Governments take money from households in order to purchase goods and services by businesses, presumably for the benefit of the society as a whole. And then there are imports and exports. So we have a business sector, a household sector, a banking sector, a government sector, and then we have overseas, the rest of the world. Now, that's not a completely insane model of that represents an economic system. Now, does that economic system work perfectly? Well, no, we wouldn't expect it to necessarily work perfectly, and we can think of ways in which it could generate problems for itself. You could say that everything would be hunky-dory in this economic system if all of the resources owned by the households were employed by the businesses. There was full employment of resources, so that the maximum amount of goods and services that the economy could produce would be produced. There's a start. So the economy is operating at full employment, you might say. Now, everything will go well, the economy will be in equilibrium, it will be stable, there will be no tendency for it to move, if the amount of money or income that is withdrawn or leaks out of the core is simultaneously injected back into the core. So if the investment level equals the savings level, then we have an equilibrium condition. If government expenditure equals taxation, then again the amount withdrawn equals the amount injected back in. And if exports equals imports, then again the amount withdrawn equals the amount injected back in. But we can also easily imagine scenarios where those couples of injections and withdrawals wouldn't necessarily be equal. After all, the agents, for example, in the case of savings and investment, the people who are saving and the people who are investing are entirely different groups that aren't in any way coordinated. They have their own motives, they behave according to their own needs and wants. So it's entirely possible that the amount that's saved could be more or less than the amount that firms would want to invest. There could be an imbalance between domestic savings and domestic investment. In which case, let's say that there's insufficient savings available for investment purposes domestically, businesses wouldn't then throw up their hands and say, oh well, never mind, I'll just have to go without. Rather, they will seek funds elsewhere. That is, they might seek funds from overseas and borrow from overseas to fund investment, which would add to the foreign debt. Equally, we could look at government expenditure and taxation. There's no reason to believe that government expenditure must equal taxation. It's entirely possible that a government might spend more than it collects in tax, in which case it has to borrow the money from somewhere or create it. Equally, it's possible for the tax revenue collected to be greater than the government expenditure, in which case the government would quote-unquote save money, run a budget surplus. And lucky last, of course, we can easily imagine a scenario where import expenditure is greater than export expenditure. That is, the amount of money flowing out of the country due to households purchasing imports might be greater than the export revenue coming into the country. That is, there would be a trade deficit. That could happen too. So we can already see, what can we see? One, we can see the different sectors which would make up an economy. We can see how they basically interact with each other to form a whole system. And we can see how that system could be in equilibrium, in a state of stability, but equally it could be in a state of disequilibrium due to the injections not being equal to the withdrawals, which could create problems. Or it could be beneficial in some cases, but that's something we might look at a little bit later.